On August 19, 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki landed on Guadalcanal with 917 of Japan's finest soldiers. He had a diary in his breast pocket. He had already written the schedule for the next 3 days. August 20th, Night March. August 21st, Enjoy the fruits of victory. No entry for August 22nd. He didn't think he'd need one. 3 days later, 128 of those 917 men were still alive. The rest were on a white sand beach under the Guadalcanal sun. At Rabaul, when the radio report came in, the operations officer, a man who had met Ichiki personally before he boarded ship, read it twice, set it down, and said, "I think this report is incorrect." Not because he doubted the numbers. Because Ichiki could not have lost. It was that simple. General Hyakutake called the next man in, spread the map of Guadalcanal on the table. The second man came with 6,000 troops. He failed too. The third time, Hyakutake came himself, with 20,000 men, heavy artillery, and a staff already assigned to plan the surrender ceremony. He failed worse than either of them. 3 times, 3 men, and one question that none of them ever asked out loud, not because they weren't intelligent, but because the answer would have destroyed something they had believed their entire lives. December 1941. Singapore fell in 70 days. The photograph of British General Percival signing the surrender document ran on the front page of every newspaper in Japan. Percival was tall, thin, pale, walking toward the Japanese delegation with a white flag, his uniform hanging off him like it belonged to a larger man. The photograph was reproduced millions of times, framed in government offices, pinned to barracks walls, not to inform, to confirm what they already knew. At Japanese military academies, cadets were taught one principle above all others, repeated in every lecture, written into every training manual. Yamato spirit overcomes material strength. The idea wasn't a slogan. It was treated as a military law, as verifiable as ballistics, tested in China, proven in Malaya, demonstrated again and again against enemies who had more equipment, but less will. The intelligence assessment of the American Marines at Guadalcanal, August 1942. An internal document, not a propaganda poster. American soldiers lack discipline, are incapable of coordinated night combat, and will break under direct and sustained pressure. Every officer who read that assessment had evidence to support it. The fall of the Philippines, the collapse at Wake Island, the retreat at Bataan. Americans gave ground. Americans surrendered. The record was there. They were reading the right data. They were asking the wrong question. That same month at Noumea, 400 miles south of Guadalcanal, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner was sitting at a metal desk in a converted office, reading the same intelligence reports everyone else was reading, this time about Japanese night-fighting capability. The report described their training programs, their equipment, their tactical doctrine for surface engagements after dark. Turner read through it once, then went back to one paragraph and read it again. He underlined a single sentence, wrote 3 words in the margin in pencil. "We have not." He didn't call a meeting, didn't issue a directive, just underlined the sentence, folded the report, and put it in the top drawer of his desk where he would see it every morning. 14 days later, his supply ships were heading back to Guadalcanal. Truk Atoll, August 16, 1942. The briefing room was hot, even at 8 in the morning. Officers sat in rows in front of a map of Guadalcanal, tacked to a wooden board. The intelligence officer read from his notes. Between 2,000 and 10,000 Marines were holding the Lunga perimeter. The airfield was operational. The Americans had radar. Orders from 17th Army Command were explicit. Reconnaissance first. No direct assault. Wait for the second echelon of the regiment to arrive before committing. Ichiki sat in the front row. He listened to all of it. He packed 7 days of rations for his men. Not because supplies were short. There was more available. 7 days because he had looked at the map, calculated the march time, added a day, and decided that was sufficient. A man who plans for contingencies is a man who expects to need them. Ichiki did not expect to need them. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers ran at full speed through the darkness and put 917 men ashore at Taivu Point. The landing was clean. No contact. The men assembled on the beach in less than an hour, checked their equipment, and moved into the tree line. Ichiki left 100 men at Taivu as rear guard. He led the remaining 800 west along the coast toward Henderson Field, 22 miles away. He didn't wait for the second echelon. The order to wait had been given by officers who, in Ichiki's judgment, did not fully understand the situation on the ground. He understood it. The Americans were demoralized from the Savo Island defeat. They were isolated. They were weak. One hard push in the night, and Henderson Field would fall before the second echelon was even needed. 2 miles into the march, his advance scouts made contact with an American patrol. A short firefight. The scouts took casualties and pulled back to report. Ichiki received the report while still moving. He kept moving. He radioed Rabaul. No enemy presence, like marching through empty land. What Ichiki had no way of knowing. 8 days before he landed at Taivu Point, a radio intercept station in Hawaii, Station Hypo, the same team that had broken Japanese naval codes before Midway, had decrypted a signal connecting his name to Destroyer Squadron 2 and the word Guadalcanal. The decrypt reached Vandegrift's intelligence officer on August 10th. They had 9 days to prepare. The marine line at the Ilu River had been reinforced, pre-sighted, and waiting. When Ichiki's scouts made contact with that American patrol 2 miles from the perimeter, they hadn't stumbled onto a random outpost. They had found the forward edge of a trap that had been built specifically for them. Ichiki's radio report, like marching through empty land, went out at 11:30 at night. The Marines on the Ilu River line could hear the Japanese column moving through the jungle toward them. They had been in their fighting positions for hours. Some of them had been waiting since sundown. Before dawn on August 21st, right on the schedule written in the diary, Ichiki attacked. No artillery preparation, no reconnaissance of the wire. 800 men running across open white sand in the darkness toward a defensive line they had never seen. Correspondent Richard Tregaskis was embedded with the Marines that night. He wrote in his notebook later, "We heard them before we saw them. They were making noise, shouting even. They weren't trying to be quiet." The machine guns on both flanks opened simultaneously. The first wave broke on the barbed wire. Men piled into it, tangled, fell. The ones behind them pushed forward into the same wire. The guns kept firing. Ichiki sent a second wave into the same gap, then a third. At first light, Vandegrift sent tanks and a full battalion into the coconut grove east of the Ilu, behind what remained of Ichiki's force. The survivors had pulled back into the tree line and had no route out. The grove was dense, the undergrowth chest-high, the ground soft. The tanks moved slowly and methodically. 789 of 917 men died on Guadalcanal that day and night. Ichiki burned his regimental colors in the grove. Then he died. Accounts differ on whether by his own hand in the final minutes or in the fighting itself. Either way, he did not survive the morning. The Marines who walked the beach afterward were mostly quiet. One corporal, interviewed later, said only, "They ain't supermen. They're just tricky bastards." Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote the same thing more formally, that the battle had proven, for the first time, that American Marines could fight Japanese veterans in the jungle and win. At Rabaul, General Hyakutake received the report and sent a single line to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The attack of the Ichiki detachment was not entirely successful. The question raised in the operations room was not, how well can the Marines fight? It was, did Ichiki have enough men? Hyakutake opened his desk drawer, pulled out Kawaguchi's file. At Numea, Turner sat across from his chief of staff and went through his notebook page by page, everything he had done wrong at Savo Island. The miscommunication with the screening force, the failure to establish clear command responsibilities, the 8 hours it had taken him to receive a reconnaissance report that should have reached him in 2. He gave the list to his staff and told them to read it. 15 days after Savo, his transports were back in the waters around Guadalcanal. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi read the Ichiki after-action report carefully. He was methodical by nature, a career officer who had fought in China and Borneo, who understood that battles were won through planning and not just willpower. He underlined 2 words in the report: frontal assault. His analysis: Ichiki had attacked the wrong way, across the wrong terrain with insufficient force. The beach approach was suicide against a prepared defense. The answer was the jungle, terrain the Americans hadn't fortified, couldn't see into, and couldn't cover with interlocking fire. Go around. Go through. Hit from a direction they weren't watching. He was right about the tactics. He was completely wrong about what was waiting for him. Before he shipped out, Kawaguchi packed his dress-white uniform, the formal attire worn by Japanese officers at surrender ceremonies. He intended to be wearing it when Vandegrift signed the document handing over Guadalcanal. Marine raiders hit his supply depot at Tazimboko 2 days before his main attack. They found the uniform. They took it. Kawaguchi landed 6,000 men on Guadalcanal in late August and early September. He spent 2 weeks planning a 3-pronged assault on Henderson Field from the south and east, the jungle approach that Ichiki had never considered. He was confident. He had 3 times the force Ichiki had brought. He had artillery. He had a plan that was tactically sound, that learned from what had gone wrong before. He offered to accept an additional battalion from Hyakutake. Then he shook his head and turned it down. Not necessary. I'll be done in 1 night. The jungle did what Guadalcanal's jungle always did to carefully made schedules. The 3 columns got separated almost immediately. Communication between them relied on runners who got lost in terrain that had no trails, no landmarks, and no reliable way to navigate in darkness. Units that were supposed to arrive at their jump-off positions simultaneously arrived hours apart. The march that was supposed to take 2 days took 3. Kawaguchi pushed forward anyway. There was no contingency plan. The attack would happen when it happened. The coordination would work itself out. On the night of September 12th, his main force came up the long grassy slope of the ridge south of Henderson Field. The ground was open here, the grass waist-high, the night black and wet. Marine foxholes lined the crest. Fewer than 800 raiders and paratroopers held the entire position. Kawaguchi had nearly 3,000 men on that slope. For 2 nights, his troops attacked in waves up the ridge. Each wave reached the crest in different places and at different times. Never enough men in one place at one moment to break through completely. The Marines shifted their reserves from point to point along the line, plugging gaps as they opened, giving ground, and taking it back. At 3 in the morning on September 13th, Kawaguchi was positioned below the crest, listening to the sounds of the battle above him. The firing was intense. His men were clearly in contact. He believed, had to believe, from everything he could hear, that the line had finally broken. He radioed his flanking units, "Press the attack." What he couldn't see, 300 yards up the slope in the rain and the dark, was Edson walking the Marine line in both directions, stopping at each foxhole, looking each man in the face, his voice completely level. "This is it. There is no better place to die." The line held. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi was leading what remained of his brigade on a 5-day march west through the same jungle they had come through. They left more than 850 dead on the ridge. The survivors were malnourished, many had malaria, and they had no food for the march. He sat down that night and wrote his after-action report. He did not blame the terrain. He did not blame the weather. He did not write that his men had lacked spirit or that the plan had been sound in principle. He wrote that the American Marines had fought with a skill, discipline, and determination that exceeded anything Japanese intelligence had predicted, that the fundamental assumptions about American fighting ability needed to be revised before any further operations were planned. It was the first time any Japanese officer had put those words in an official document. He was relieved of command. His report was classified, filed, not distributed to any officer planning the next operation. Hyakutake never read it, not because anyone stopped him, but because in the system he operated in, a report that challenged the fundamental assumptions about the enemy did not travel upward. It disappeared. If you think this story deserves to be heard, the like button is right there. 1 second. It's how this reaches the people who've never heard the name Guadalcanal. At Noumea, Turner stayed aboard until the last crate was unloaded, then went below. No record of what he said. Only this: he added one line to his notebook before he slept. General Hyakutake stood before his assembled officers on Guadalcanal on October 22, 1942, with more than 20,000 Japanese troops on the island, and said, "The time of the decisive battle between Japan and the United States has come." He had already assigned members of his staff to begin planning the surrender ceremony, the precise location, the sequence of events, which American officers would be present, how the formal document would be worded. He wanted it conducted with such precision and dignity that it would be spoken of throughout the Japanese army for years. The date of the attack on Henderson Field had been set for October 22nd, then pushed to the 23rd because Maruyama's force hadn't reached its position, then pushed again to the 24th. Hyakutake postponed the date. He did not revise the plan. A Japanese soldier captured near the perimeter that week was asked by a Marine intelligence officer why the attack hadn't been modified when conditions on the ground made the original concept unworkable. The prisoner sat quietly for a moment, then said, "The plan had been made. No one would have dared to change it. It must go as it is written. 20,000 men, heavy artillery, tanks, 2 simultaneous attacks designed to hit Henderson Field from multiple directions at once and overwhelm the defenders before they could shift reserves. Northern thrust, General Sumiyoshi with 5 battalions along the coast road. A diversion to fix the Marines in place and draw attention away from the main effort. Southern thrust, General Maruyama leading 7,000 men of the 2nd Sendai Division through the jungle south of Henderson Field. 15 miles of the worst terrain on the island. No trails. Rivers and ravines not shown on any map. Ridge lines that ran in every direction except the one you needed. The plan was elegant on paper. The paper did not include Guadalcanal's jungle. The march south took 10 days to cover 15 miles. Maruyama's men moved through terrain that swallowed men whole. Not jungle in the way anyone had imagined it, but a maze of razor-edged kunai grass, taller than a man's head, ravines that appeared without warning, rivers with no banks, mud that pulled at boots until the boots came off. Every artillery piece required 30 men to carry it. Dozens were abandoned, not because the men gave up, but because the math stopped working. Too much weight, too little time. The attack date moved to the 23rd, then the 24th. Hyakutake notified his commanders each time. He did not change the plan. On the night of October 23rd, Sumiyoshi's artillery opened up on schedule, the original schedule before either postponement. Tank engines started in the darkness along the coast road. The northern diversionary attack went forward as planned. Maruyama's force was still in the jungle. He wouldn't reach his position for another 24 hours. The two prongs of the attack that were designed to strike simultaneously struck 24 hours apart. The Marines dealt with Sumiyoshi's tanks on the coast road that night. 9 or 10 Type 97s coming in column, stopped by a 37mm anti-tank gun that had been dug in for exactly that purpose. One by one. When Maruyama's men finally reached the southern perimeter the following night, the Marines on the coast road had already stood down and gone back to their positions. Private First Class Mitchell Page, a machine gunner on the southern perimeter, was still at his weapon at 3 in the morning when the men on either side of him were dead or wounded. He kept firing. When the gun jammed, he cleared it. When it jammed again, he pulled a dead man's rifle and kept going. Sergeant John Basilone had 2 water-cooled M1917 machine guns further along the line. When ammunition ran out at one gun, he carried cases through the dark under fire. He burned his hands on barrels that had overheated past any safe temperature. He kept both guns running through the night. At 3 in the morning, a radio message from Maruyama reached Hyakutake's command post. Airfield perimeter broken through. The perimeter hadn't been broken through. Maruyama, in the darkness and confusion of a firefight that stretched across hundreds of meters of jungle, believed what he needed to believe. His men were at the wire. They were through the wire in some places. That was close enough to report as a breakthrough. When daylight came, he could see what had actually happened. 941 Japanese soldiers were counted dead on the southern approach. General Nasu, who had led the first wave, was among them. The line had bent in places. It had not broken. Hyakutake sat in his command tent for 3 hours after the final reports came in. There are no records of what was said in that tent, or whether anything was said at all. His staff waited outside. Nobody went in. Then he emerged and dictated the cable to Tokyo. The cable acknowledged that the attack on Henderson Field had not succeeded. It cited difficult terrain and adverse weather conditions as contributing factors. It did not mention the Marines by name. It did not use the word failure. It did not contain a single sentence that Kawaguchi's classified report, sitting in a filing cabinet at Rabaul that Hyakutake had never opened, hadn't already explained in precise detail 6 weeks earlier. Turner, December 1942. The American Division came ashore on Guadalcanal in daylight to relieve the 1st Marine Division. Clean landing. No attack during the approach. No ships lost. The first major reinforcement in the entire campaign that had arrived without casualties. 3 images. No commentary required. Ichiki wrote a victory schedule in his diary before he ever set foot on the island. Kawaguchi wrote the truth in his after-action report. Was relieved. His report was locked away and never distributed. Hyakutake blamed terrain and weather in his cable to Tokyo. He had been on the island. He had seen what happened. He wrote what the system would accept. After the evacuation in February 1943, when the senior Army and Navy commanders at Imperial General Headquarters finally sat down to understand what had gone wrong at Guadalcanal, one of them said, in an internal meeting, not for publication, what Kawaguchi had already written 14 months earlier. We misjudged the enemy at every level. Kawaguchi's report had said exactly that. Filed, classified, never read. The system hadn't hidden the truth from its generals deliberately. It had no mechanism for transmitting information that contradicted its foundational assumptions. The report existed. The filing cabinet existed. The lock on the cabinet was not a conspiracy. It was bureaucratic procedure applied uniformly to documents that challenged official doctrine. Hyakutake could not have read it, not because anyone stopped him, because in the system he operated in, a document that said, "We were wrong about our enemy," was not a document that moved upward. It was a document that disappeared. 3 generals, 1 answer, 0 transmissions. February 7th, 1943. The last Japanese soldiers left Guadalcanal in the darkness before dawn, wading out to destroyers waiting offshore. They left behind their dead, their equipment, their artillery pieces still pointed at Henderson Field. American intelligence, watching the destroyers approach the island in convoy, initially classified the movement as a reinforcement operation. It looked exactly like the Tokyo Express runs that had been coming for 6 months. By the time the truth was confirmed, the ships were already gone. In an emergency session at Imperial General Headquarters, a staff officer read aloud from a damage assessment. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then the Army Chief of Staff said, "Guadalcanal may develop into the decisive battle of this war." It already had. They were 6 months late in understanding it. At Noumea, Turner was already at his desk with the maps for New Georgia spread open in front of him. Same desk, same pencil. The Savo Island notebook was in the drawer, more worn now, the cover softened from being handled. He had stopped thinking of Savo as a defeat sometime around November. He thought of it the way a surgeon thinks of a patient who died on the table in the first year of training, not as a failure to be buried, but as a case to be understood completely, so it never happened the same way again. He called it the first time we learned how to fight. The road from Guadalcanal to Tokyo ran through New Georgia, through Bougainville, through the Marianas, through Iwo Jima, through Okinawa. Turner was at every one of them. He was still learning at every one of them. On the morning of September 14th, after Kawaguchi's force had pulled back from Edson's Ridge, a Marine walked the crest and counted the Japanese dead on the slope below. He stopped counting at 400. There were more. He had been on the island for 38 days. He was 19 years old. He sat down on the grass at the top of the ridge, looked out at Henderson Field below, the runway still intact, the aircraft still there, and didn't say anything. Nobody who was there that morning recorded what the silence felt like, but every man who survived it carried it with them. 3 generals came to that island with the same certainty, and left, those who left, with the same confusion. Not, why did we lose? The question they couldn't ask was simpler and more devastating than that. Were we wrong about who we were fighting? Ichiki couldn't ask it. It never occurred to him that he needed to. Kawaguchi asked it, wrote the answer down, and was removed from command. Hyakutake arrived with a surrender ceremony already planned and left the island without one. The question that could have changed everything was answered on that island, in the jungle, and on the ridge lines, by the men who held the line. They didn't need to ask it. A lot of you grew up hearing pieces of this history, not from textbooks, from the dinner table. A grandfather who would go quiet for a moment, then say one sentence about an island, about a friend, about a night he never talked about otherwise. Those stories aren't in any archive. They don't exist anywhere except in the people who were told them. Leave one here, even just a sentence, We want to hear them.
Imagine a vast, serene Pacific Ocean in the early months of 1942. The Empire of Japan, riding high on a wave of victories, seemed unstoppable. From Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, their navy dominated. But hidden beneath the surface, a single oil slick, a seemingly insignificant trail on the water would change everything. Today, we're diving into the story of the Mikuma, a Japanese heavy cruiser often overlooked in the grand narrative of Midway. Yet, she became a symbol of the quiet collapse of Japan's combined fleet. This is the tale of how one small detail sealed her fate. In the spring of 1942, Japan was at the peak of its power in the Pacific theater of the Second World War. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had crippled the American battleship fleet. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Their carrier task forces roamed freely, striking as far as Ceylon in the Indian Ocean. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, knew this momentum couldn't last forever. America was rebuilding, and Yamamoto believed a decisive blow was needed to force them to the negotiating table. Enter Operation MI, the plan to seize Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of land midway between Hawaii and Japan. Midway wasn't just strategic, it was bait. Yamamoto intended to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap. He assembled the largest naval armada in history, over 200 ships, including 11 battleships, 8 carriers, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. The goal? Annihilate the U.S. Pacific Fleet and secure Japan's defensive perimeter. But unbeknownst to the Japanese, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked JN-25, the Imperial Navy's main operational code. They knew Yamamoto's plans in advance. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, positioned his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown northeast of Midway, ready to spring an ambush. The stage was set for one of the most pivotal battles in naval history. Now, let's zoom in on our protagonist, the heavy cruiser Mikuma. She was part of Cruiser Division 7, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. Mikuma belonged to the Mogami-class innovative ships designed in the 1930s to push the limits of the Washington Naval Treaty. These cruisers were fast, heavily armed, and versatile. Mikuma displaced about 13,000 tons, stretched 570 feet long, and could slice through the waves at 35 knots. Her main battery? 10 8-inch guns and 5 twin turrets, capable of hurling shells over 20 miles. She also carried torpedoes, anti-aircraft guns, and even float planes for reconnaissance. Commissioned in August 1935, Mikuma had already seen plenty of action. She supported the invasion of Malaya, bombarded British forces in the Indian Ocean, and escorted carriers during raids on Darwin, Australia. By May 1942, she was a seasoned veteran, crewed by around 900 sailors and officers, many of whom were battle-hardened from Pearl Harbor. Her captain, Shakao Sakayama, was a capable commander, known for his discipline and tactical acumen. As part of Kurita's force, Mikuma's role in Operation MI was to provide gunfire support for the invasion of Midway and screen the main body of the fleet. She sailed from Guam on May 27, joining the massive formation steaming toward the atoll. The journey was tense but optimistic. Japanese sailors believed in their invincibility. Propaganda painted them as warriors of the divine wind. Little did they know, the Americans were waiting. On June 4, the battle erupted. Japanese carriers launched strikes against Midway, but American torpedo bombers and dive bombers counterattacked. In a span of minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze by American SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Later that afternoon, Hiryu was also mortally wounded. Yamamoto's trap had backfired spectacularly. With 4 carriers lost, he canceled the invasion and ordered a general withdrawal. But the damage wasn't done yet. The retreating fleet was vulnerable. scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. Mikuma, along with her sisters Mogami, Suzuya, and Kumano, plus destroyers, was tasked with bombarding Midway as a diversion. That plan was scrapped too. Now they had to race westward, evading American submarines and aircraft. The night of June 5 was pitch black, no moon, heavy clouds. Kurita's cruisers pushed their engines to the limit, zigzagging to avoid torpedoes. Tension gripped the bridges. Lookouts strained their eyes for enemy silhouettes. This was the setup for disaster. According to post-war reports from the Imperial Japanese Navy, the fleet was in disarray. Communications were spotty. Fatigue set in after days at sea. Captain Sakayama later noted in his log, though much of it was lost, that the crew remained vigilant. But the weight of the carrier losses hung heavy. One survivor recalled the mood. Whispers of defeat rippled through the ranks for the first time. Mikuma's position in the formation was critical. As a heavy cruiser, she was the muscle ready to engage any pursuers with her big guns. But in retreat, speed was everything. The Mogami-class ships were among the fastest in the fleet. But even they couldn't outrun fate. As dawn approached on June 6, the real tragedy unfolded. But before we get there, consider this. Midway wasn't just about carriers. It was about the small decisions, the overlooked details, that turned tides. For Mikuma, her mission seemed straightforward: survive and return home. Yet, in the dark hours ahead, a collision would expose her to the merciless skies. What happened next would make her the first Japanese heavy cruiser sunk in the war. Stay with me as we uncover the chain of events that led to her doom. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, where battles are won and lost on razor-thin margins, Mikuma's story reminds us that history often hinges on the unforeseen. A routine maneuver gone wrong, a trail left behind, and an enemy ready to pounce. This is just the beginning. The night of June 5, 1942, cloaked the Pacific in an impenetrable darkness. No moon lit the way. Heavy clouds smothered the stars. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's cruiser division, 7 Mikuma, Mogami, Suzuya, and Kumano, flanked by destroyers Arashio and Asashio, pushed westward at full steam. The order from Admiral Yamamoto had come through. Retreat. The loss of the carriers was a gut punch, but survival was now the priority. The ships zigzagged through the waves, engines roaring, to evade any lurking American submarines. On Mikuma's bridge, Captain Shakao Sakayama scanned the horizon with binoculars, his face etched with exhaustion. The crew, still reeling from the day's disasters, manned their stations in grim silence. Lookouts peered into the void, their eyes burning from strain. This was no orderly withdrawal. It was a desperate flight. Around 11:30 p.m., the destroyer Arashio spotted something, a shadowy silhouette on the water. It was the American submarine Tambor, lurking like a predator in the deep. Alerts blared across the formation. Mogami, leading the line just ahead of Mikuma, veered sharply to starboard to dodge potential torpedoes. In the chaos, her captain misjudged the turn. With a deafening crash that echoed across the sea, Mogami's bow slammed into Mikuma's port quarter. Metal screamed against metal. Sparks flew in the night. Mogami's prow crumpled like tinfoil, shearing off nearly 40 feet of her hull. On Mikuma, the impact ripped open her portside fuel tanks. Thousands of gallons of heavy fuel oil gushed into the ocean. The collision was no mere bump. It was catastrophic. Mikuma shuddered from stem to stern, her decks buckling under the force. Alarms wailed. Emergency lights flickered on. Crewmen were thrown from their feet, some suffering broken bones or concussions. In the engine rooms, engineers scrambled to assess the damage. The portside bunker had been torn wide, and oil poured out unchecked. Captain Sakayama, steadying himself on the bridge, barked orders to secure the area. Damage control parties rushed in with pumps and patches, but the gash was too large. Temporary seals, canvas, wood, even cement were slapped on, but they held for only so long. The oil slick began to form almost immediately. A dark, iridescent trail snaking behind the wounded cruiser. It stretched for miles, visible even in the dim light to any aircraft overhead. Mikuma's speed dropped dramatically. From her top 35 knots, she limped along at just 12, barely faster than a merchant ship. She became the weak link in the chain, forcing the entire division to slow down. Mogami fared even worse. Her bow gone, she could barely make headway. The two sisters, once proud hunters, were now crippled prey. In the aftermath, radio silence was broken briefly to report the incident to Kurita. The Admiral, aboard Kumano, decided to press on. Destroyers Arashio and Asashio were detached to escort the damaged pair. The rest of the force sped ahead, leaving them vulnerable. This decision would prove fateful. Survivors' accounts paint a vivid picture of the panic below decks. One petty officer on Mikuma recalled the stench of fuel oil filling the air, seeping into compartments. Men coughed and retched as fumes spread. The fear was palpable, not just of sinking, but of fire. Oil on water burns fiercely, and any spark could ignite an inferno. Yet, discipline held. Japanese naval training emphasized stoicism. Complaints were rare. Captain Sakiyama, drawing on his experience from earlier campaigns, rallied his officers. He knew the oil trail was a beacon for the enemy. In a log entry recovered later from debris, he noted, "The leak cannot be fully stemmed. We proceed with caution, aware of the risk from above." Post-war analyses from the U.S. Naval War College highlight this moment as a classic example of how minor accidents amplify in war. The collision wasn't due to incompetence. It was the fog of war fatigue, poor visibility, and the pressure of pursuit. Tambo, the sub that triggered it all, didn't even fire. She just observed and reported, but her presence set off the chain reaction. The oil slick, that insidious trail, was the real killer. In daylight, it would glisten like a road map, leading straight to the stragglers. As the hours ticked toward dawn, the group limped on. Suzuya and Kumano were now far ahead, out of sight. Mikuma and Mogami, with their destroyer escorts, formed a ragged quartet. The sea was calm, almost mocking in its tranquility, but tension built like a storm on the horizon. Crewmen on watch strained to hear the drone of engines, American planes, perhaps from the carriers that had decimated their own. Intelligence reports had warned of Enterprise and Hornet still operational. If they launched scouts, the oil would give them away. One can imagine the whispers among the sailors. Will we make it to the submarine screen? To home waters? For many, home was a distant dream now. The Imperial Navy's code of Bushido demanded they fight on, but doubt crept in. This was the turning point. What started as a tactical retreat was morphing into a survival ordeal. The wound from the collision wasn't fatal yet, but it exposed Mikuma to the elements, to the enemy. In the vast Pacific, where distances are measured in days, a 12-knot speed was a death sentence. American aviators, fueled by victory, were eager for more. As June 6 broke, the first light revealed the slick in all its damning glory. It stretched back eastward, a black ribbon on blue water. From 10,000 feet, it would be unmissable. Pilots from Task Force 16, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, were already airborne. Scout planes fanned out, searching for stragglers. One VB-6 Dauntless from Enterprise spotted it first. The report crackled back. Oil trail sighted. Following to source, the noose tightened. Mikuma's anti-aircraft gunners checked their weapons. Ammunition was loaded. Eyes turned skyward. Captain Sakiyama prepared for the worst. He didn't know it yet, but the skies were about to unleash hell. The oil had betrayed them. What followed was a barrage that would test the limits of human endurance. But that's for the next chapter. For now, picture those ships, wounded and alone, steaming into an uncertain dawn. The collision had sealed their isolation. The slick had signed their warrant. In war, it's often the small things, the overlooked leak, the midnight mishap that write the epitaphs. Mikuma's story is a reminder. Victory at Midway wasn't just about the carriers. It was about the relentless pursuit that followed. The Americans weren't done. Far from it. They were coming. Wings spread wide, bombs ready, and Mikuma, trailing her fatal signature, had nowhere to hide. As the first rays of dawn pierced the eastern horizon on June 6, 1942, the Pacific Ocean awoke to a deceptive calm. The oil slick from Mikuma's ruptured tanks shimmered under the early light, a treacherous ribbon stretching miles behind her. It was a dead giveaway, a natural flare, signaling vulnerability to any eyes in the sky. Aboard the American carrier Enterprise, part of Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, scout planes had taken off at first light. These SBD Dauntless dive bombers, piloted by battle-tested airmen from Bombing Squadron 6, fanned out in search patterns. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the air group, had orders to hunt down stragglers from the retreating Japanese fleet. Around 8 a.m., one scout spotted the telltale trail. The radio crackled to life. Oil slick sighted, leading to enemy cruisers. Coordinates follow. Word spread like wildfire through the American carriers. Hornets squadrons joined in. In total, 81 aircraft would converge dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. This wasn't a hasty strike. It was methodical vengeance. Back on Mikuma, the morning watch had just changed. Sailors sipped weak tea, trying to shake off the night's ordeal. The air reeked of fuel. Decks were slick with residue. Captain Shikao Sakiyama, nursing bruises from the collision, conferred with his executive officer, Commander Takashima. They knew the risk. Daylight meant exposure. Anti-aircraft crews stood ready at their 3-inch guns and machine guns. Lookouts scanned the skies. Then, the dreaded sound, a low hum growing into a roar. "Enemy planes inbound!" shouted a spotter. Alarms blared. Men raced to battle stations. The first wave hit around 10 a.m. 31 Dauntlesses from Enterprise. They circled high, out of flak range, then peeled off in steep dives. Whistles pierced the air as bombs plummeted. Mikuma's gunners opened up, tracers arcing skyward. But the Americans were precise. The lead bombs struck amidships, detonating near turret number 3. Shrapnel flew. Flames erupted from the gun mount. Dozens of crewmen were cut down instantly. A second hit the bridge wing, wounding Sakiyama in the leg and arm. Blood splattered the charts. He collapsed but refused evacuation. "Keep fighting!" he gasped, directing from a stretcher. The attack lasted minutes, but felt eternal. Mogami, nearby, took hits too, her decks ablaze. Destroyers Arashio and Asashio maneuvered frantically, laying smoke screens. But the oil on the water ignited in places, turning the sea into patches of fire. Wounded sailors screamed. Medics worked amid chaos. This was just the opener. The Japanese fought back fiercely. Mikuma's remaining guns barked, downing at least one attacker. But the Dauntlesses were relentless, designed for this punishing role. By noon, a brief lull. Damage reports flooded in. Engineering spaces flooded. Speed further reduced. Fires raged below decks. Pumps strained against the influx. Crewmen formed bucket brigades, passing seawater hand to hand. The heat was infernal. Smoke choked the air. One engineer recalled later, "It was like breathing fire. We thought the ship would explode any second." Yet, morale held barely. Officers invoked the spirit of the samurai. urging men to their posts. Takashima took temporary command, his voice steady over the intercom. But the Americans weren't finished. Around 1 p.m., the second wave arrived, more Dauntlesses from Hornet, joined by torpedo bombers. 26 planes this time. They came in low and high, a coordinated assault. Torpedoes skimmed the water. Bombs rained down. Mikuma twisted and turned, but her wounds slowed her. A torpedo struck portside. Below the waterline, water gushed in. Compartments flooded rapidly. Then, a bomb penetrated the engine room, igniting fuel lines. Explosions rippled through the hull. The third turret's magazine detonated in a massive blast. Flames shot skyward. Debris rained down. Over 100 men perished in that instant, vaporized or crushed. The ship listed heavily to port, her superstructure mangled. Horatio pulled alongside, taking off survivors amid the barrage. But many stayed, manning guns until the end. The final wave struck at 1:58 p.m. Another 24 aircraft, pounding the cripples. Mikuma took at least 5 more bombs and 2 torpedoes. Her torpedo tubes, armed with long lances, cooked off in a chain reaction. Half the stern vanished in a fireball. The mainmast toppled, radio antennas sparked and fell. By now, she was a floating pyre, flames licking every deck. Sailors, faces blackened with soot, fired whatever weapons remained. One machine gunner kept shooting until his position was engulfed. American pilots, circling for confirmation, reported. Cruiser burning fiercely, dead in the water. Mogami, though battered, managed to limp away with help, but Mikuma was doomed. As the attacks subsided around 3 p.m., the full horror unfolded. Hundreds wounded. Bodies littered the decks. The list worsened 30 degrees. Then 40. Abandon ship, came the order from Takashima. Men jumped into the oily sea, some aflame. The water burned around them, screams echoed. Life rafts were scarce. Many clung to wreckage. Destroyers circled, picking up whom they could. But in the confusion, some were left behind. Survivor testimonies, collected post-war by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, reveal the human cost. One Mikuma sailor described, "The bombs came like thunderbolts. Friends vanished before my eyes. I swam through fire, thinking of my family." Another, Captain Sakayama, bandaged and pale, saluted us as we left. He knew his end. Indeed, Sakayama stayed aboard, too injured to swim. Takashima joined him, choosing death over capture, a final act of honor. In Japanese tradition, this was seppuku at sea. Though no blade was needed, the ship would suffice. American records from the after-action reports praise the Japanese defense. "Tenacious AA fire," noted one pilot. They didn't quit, but superiority in the air was overwhelming. Spruance's decision to pursue was bold, risking his carriers but sealing the victory. Midway's air power shift was evident here, carriers projecting force hundreds of miles away. For the Japanese, this attack exposed flaws, poor damage control compared to U.S. standards, and over-reliance on speed that failed when crippled. The oil slick, that silent traitor, had enabled it all. Without it, Mikuma might have slipped away in the vast ocean. Instead, she became a target. As the sun dipped lower, the cruiser groaned, her hull twisting. Fires consumed what remained. At dusk, she rolled over, stern first, vanishing beneath the waves at coordinates 29 degrees 20 minutes north, 173 degrees 30 minutes east. Bubbles and debris marked her grave. But for the survivors temporarily safe on the destroyers, the ordeal continued. 240 were rescued initially, but many succumbed to wounds. Sakayama died 3 days later aboard a Sashio. 2 sailors, adrift on a raft, were picked up by an American submarine after enduring sharks and sun. Their interrogation provided valuable intel. This wasn't the end of the story. The sinking of Mikuma rippled far beyond. She was the first heavy cruiser Japan lost in the war, a harbinger of attrition to come. For the men who fought through those hellish hours, it was a testament to endurance. But as night fell on June 6th, the sea claimed its due. What became of the rest? The legacy of this forgotten victim of Midway awaits in our final chapter. Stay tuned. As twilight descended on June 6, 1942, the Pacific turned a somber hue. Mikuma, once a sleek predator of the seas, now wallowed like a dying beast. Her hull groaned under the weight of fires and floods. The list to port had reached critical 50 degrees and worsening. Flames danced across her decks, consuming ammunition lockers and living quarters alike. Black smoke billowed into the evening sky, a funeral pyre visible for miles. Survivors clung to rails, faces grim with soot and despair. The order to abandon ship echoed through the inferno. Men leaped into the churning waters below. But this was no clean escape. The sea around her burned patches of oil ignited by sparks, turning the ocean into a hellish cauldron. Screams pierced the dusk as sailors swam through flames, their skin blistering. Some made it to rafts. Others grabbed floating debris hats, wood planks, empty shell casings. The destroyers Arashio and Asashio circled bravely, lowering nets and lines. Crewmen hauled the exhausted aboard. One by one, Mogami, herself damaged but afloat, took on as many as she could. Initial counts, 240 from Mikuma pulled from the waves, but many were gravely injured: burns, shrapnel wounds, smoke inhalation. Medics worked frantically with limited supplies, prioritizing the officers. Captain Shikao Sakiyama was among them. Lifted onto Asashio's deck, his body mangled from bomb fragments. He lingered in agony for 3 days, whispering final orders before slipping away on June 9. His death was a quiet one, far from the glory he once sought. Executive Officer Takashima chose a different path. As the ship foundered, he remained on the bridge. In the tradition of the Imperial Navy, he would not abandon his post. Survivors later spoke of seeing him salute the flag one last time. Whether by blade or by the sea's embrace, he went down with her, a deliberate act of honor. This was Bushido in its rawest form, loyalty unto death. The final plunge came at sunset. Mikuma rolled fully to port, her bow lifting briefly before submerging. Bubbles erupted. A whirlpool formed. She vanished stern first into the depths at 29 degrees, 20 minutes north, 173 degrees, 30 minutes east. The ocean swallowed her whole, leaving oil slicks and wreckage as her only tombstone. 2 sailors, separated from the group, drifted on a makeshift raft. For 3 harrowing days, they battled thirst, sharks, and exposure. Miraculously, the American submarine Trout surfaced nearby. Her crew, spotting the castaways, hauled them aboard. These men, petty officers whose names were redacted in reports, provided interrogators with details of the battle. Their accounts filled gaps in U.S. intelligence, confirming the extent of Japanese losses. Back home, the Imperial Navy downplayed the disaster. Official reports listed Mikuma as lost in action, with scant details. But the human toll was staggering. Of her 900 crew, only 188 survived long-term. The rest, over 700, perished in the attacks or the sea. Families received telegrams of regret, their loved ones enshrined as heroes at Yasukuni. Post-war inquiries revealed more. The U.S. Navy's official history noted, Mikuma was the first enemy heavy cruiser sunk by air attack alone in the war. This marked a shift air power's dominance over surface ships. For Japan, it was a harbinger. Midway cost them not just carriers, but confidence. The attrition began. Cruisers like Mikuma were irreplaceable, with shipyards strained by Allied bombings. Her class, the Mogamis, saw sisters fall one by one. Mogami at Leyte Gulf, Suzuya there too, Kumano torpedoed later. Mikuma's sinking taught harsh lessons. That oil slick underscored how minor oversights amplify in combat. A patched tank might have saved her, better night maneuvers could have prevented the collision. American after-action reviews praised their pilots' precision but critiqued Japanese damage control. U.S. Ships used CO, two systems and foam. Japanese relied on water, which spread fires in oily environments. This gap widened as the war progressed. Today, Mikuma rests in over 5,000 feet of water. Expeditions by the research vessel Petrel in 2019 located her wreck. Sonar images show her upside down, broken in two bow and stern separated. Marine life encrusts her guns. Coral claims her hull. Artifacts recovered include portholes and bells, now in museums like the Yamato Museum in Kure. Her story lives in archives. The Naval Historical Center in Washington holds pilot logs. Tokyo's war records detail survivor testimonies, one poignant account from a rescued gunner. As she sank, the sun set with her. It felt like the end of our empire's dawn. Indeed, Midway was the turning point. Japan's offensive halted. America seized the initiative, island-hopping toward Tokyo. Mikuma, though a footnote in many histories, embodies the personal tragedies behind grand strategies. She wasn't at the battle's heart like the carriers, but her fate sealed the retreat's misery. Imagine those final moments. The sea claiming steel and souls alike. The oil that doomed her, a poetic irony, fuel for her engines turned traitor. In the annals of naval warfare, she reminds us, wars are won not just by bold strokes, but by the accumulation of small failures. The collision, the slick, the bombs, all threads in a tapestry of defeat. As we close this chapter, reflect on the men of Mikuma, sailors from farms and cities, bound by duty, lost to the deep. Their sacrifice echoes through time. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the forgotten corners of Midway. If this tale of a single oil slick and its deadly consequences sparked your curiosity, share it with others. Subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Until next time, fair winds and following seas.
November 30th, 1942, 11 at night. Ironbottom Sound, Guadalcanal. 8 Japanese destroyers moving south in the dark. No lights, no radar. Drums of rice and ammunition lashed to their decks. Not a battle fleet. A supply run on the bridge of USS Minneapolis. Rear Admiral Carlton Wright had them on radar. 7,000 yards. His destroyers already in position. His guns already trained. He waited. 4 minutes later, USS Northampton was on fire. 3 more American cruisers were taking water. Nearly 400 Americans killed and wounded across the task force that night. The Japanese destroyers, outgunned, no radar, caught mid-mission with supplies still on deck, were running north at 33 knots. Wright had every advantage that night. Radar, firepower, intelligence, position. 4 minutes erased all of it. The Japanese admiral who walked away from that battle was named Raizo Tanaka. He went back to his base and filed a report. Not about how he won, about why Japan was going to lose. That report cost him the only command he had ever wanted. 14 years later, he sat down and wrote something else, in English, for an American audience. And what he put on that page, about that night, about the Americans, about what he saw from the other side of that battle, is not the kind of thing a defeated man writes to explain himself. It is the kind of thing a man writes when he has finally run out of reasons to stay quiet. If you think that story deserves to be heard, hit the like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it is the only way this reaches someone whose grandfather was out there that night. Raizo Tanaka was born in Yamaguchi Prefecture in 1892. He entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy and graduated in the class of 1913. 34th out of 118. Not first, not last, 34th. He spent the next 3 decades the way capable, patient men spend their careers, showing up, doing the work, moving up one rank at a time. His specialty was torpedoes, not in the way an officer studies a weapon for promotion, in the way a man studies the one thing he believes in completely. He was involved in the development and testing of the Type 93 torpedo, the weapon the Americans would eventually call the Long Lance. 48 knots, a range of 25 miles, no exhaust bubbles on the surface, the most capable torpedo in the world in 1942. And Tanaka knew exactly what it could do. When the war came, Tanaka was not given a fleet command. He was given the assignment nobody wanted. Guadalcanal. The Japanese army had taken the island in the summer of 1942 and begun building an airfield. The United States Marines landed in August and took it away from them. What followed was 6 months of fighting that neither side had planned for, and neither side could walk away from. The Army needed the island back. The Navy needed to keep the Army fed and armed and alive long enough to take it back. That job fell to Tanaka. The Americans gave it a name, the Tokyo Express. The Japanese, among themselves, called it something less flattering, rat transportation. Running at night, below the site of Henderson Field's aircraft, threading through the slot, the long channel between the islands, in the dark, arriving, unloading, leaving before dawn. Tanaka ran that route more times than he could count. He knew every current in those waters. He knew where the American patrol boats waited. He knew which nights the sky was dark enough to hide 8 destroyers, and which nights it was not. But what Tanaka also knew, and what made him different from nearly every other officer at his level, was what those runs were actually accomplishing. The answer was, not enough. Each destroyer could carry 200 drums of supplies. The drums were dropped overboard near shore and retrieved by small boats. American aircraft from Henderson Field sank most of them before they reached the beach. The men on Guadalcanal were not being resupplied. They were being given just enough to keep dying slowly instead of quickly. After the run on December 3rd, Tanaka called on Admiral Mikawa directly at Rabaul. He did not soften what he said. The campaign was hopeless. The men on the island were starving, and no supply run he could devise was going to change that. The only rational course was evacuation. Pull the survivors out before there were no survivors left to pull. Mikawa listened, and then did nothing. On the night of November 30th, Tanaka had left the Shortlands with 8 destroyers. 6 of them had drums of supplies lashed across their decks. To make room for the drums, those 6 ships had left their torpedo reloads behind. Each ship carried 8 torpedoes, 1 for each tube, and that was all. Tanaka's flagship Naganami and 1 escort, Takanami, were stripped for combat. The other 6 were not. He already knew the Americans were watching. A Japanese search aircraft had spotted an Allied convoy near Guadalcanal earlier that day and passed the warning to Tanaka. He told his destroyer commanders, "If we meet the enemy, forget the supplies. Attack." What Tanaka did not know, what no Japanese commander in the South Pacific fully grasped yet, was that Carlton Wright was not the man who had been running this route. Wright had been given command of Task Force 67 exactly 6 days before that night. 6 days. He had not fought in these waters. He had not been in a night surface engagement in the Solomon Islands. He did not know the feel of that channel the way Tanaka did, the way a man knows a place where he has nearly died, more than once. What Wright had was the plan. A good plan. His destroyers would be out in front, positioned to launch a torpedo attack the moment radar contact was established. The cruisers would wait. The destroyers would fire first, silently, in the dark, and then the cruisers would open up with their guns. It was the right idea. The American Navy had been losing night engagements in these waters for 4 months. Savo Island, Cape Esperance, the naval battle of Guadalcanal, battle after battle in which superior American forces had been caught hesitating, waiting for orders, waiting for confirmation, waiting for the chain of command to tell them what to do next, while Japanese torpedoes were already in the water. Wright's plan was designed to change that. What the plan could not account for was the man who had to execute it. At 11:14, Commander William Cole on USS Fletcher established firm radar contact. 8 ships, 7,000 yards, moving south along the Guadalcanal coast. The position was perfect. Fletcher and the other destroyers were exactly where they needed to be. The angle was right. The range was right. The timing was right. Cole requested permission to fire. Wright said, "Wait." 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. Cole requested permission again. Wright said, "Wait." 2 more minutes. Then Wright gave the order. Cole fired. But in those 4 minutes, Tanaka's ships had moved past the optimal firing position. The angle had closed. Fletcher's torpedoes ran long and missed. Every American torpedo fired that night missed. Cole had done everything right. He had been in position. He had made contact. He had asked twice, and then he had followed orders, the way every officer in every navy in the world was trained to do. The way the system required. Tanaka did not know the Americans were there until a lookout on Takanami spotted the column of American ships in the dark. There was no call up the chain of command, no request for permission, no pause to confirm the contact. Takanami turned and fired. That single action, one Japanese destroyer opening up without orders, triggered everything that followed. The rest of Tanaka's ships saw the muzzle flash, felt the change in the air, and in the way that men who have trained for years for exactly this moment act when the moment comes. They fired. 44 Long Lance torpedoes entered the water, running at 48 knots, in the dark, toward the muzzle flashes of American cruisers that had just given away their position. Wright had 4 minutes to change everything. He had used them waiting for certainty in a place where certainty was not available. A man who understood that waiting would cost him everything still chose to wait, because the system he was part of had never told him any other way. That is not a failure of courage. That is what a system that hasn't learned yet looks like from the inside. The first torpedo hit Minneapolis at 11:27, then a second one. The bow dropped. Water poured through the forward compartments faster than the pumps could answer it. The ship slowed from 25 knots to 5. Captain Charles Rosendahl ordered the flooding compartment sealed and kept Minneapolis moving, limping west, trailing oil, trying to stay alive long enough to reach Tulagi. 40 seconds later, New Orleans took hers. The torpedo hit forward, just below the No. 2 gun turret. It found the ammunition magazine. What happened next is described in the ship's damage report in careful, measured language. The language officers use when they are trying to write down something that does not fit inside normal words. The entire bow of New Orleans, the forward turrets, the gun crews, the men stationed there, was blown away in a single instant. The section did not sink immediately. It drifted alongside the ship, scraping down the hull as New Orleans tried to move clear of it, until it finally slipped under. The men in that forward section did not have time to know what happened. Pensacola was next. A single torpedo hit amidships. The fuel tanks ruptured. Burning oil spread across the water around the ship. The crew fought the fire for hours. Pensacola would not return to combat for nearly a year. Northampton was last. 2 torpedoes hit within minutes of each other. The engine rooms flooded. The ship began to list, slowly at first, then faster, the way a ship goes when the math of water and air has already been decided, and the only question left is time. Captain Willard Kitts ordered the crew to abandon ship at 1:55 in the morning. At 3:04, USS Northampton rolled over and went down. The survivors were in the water for hours. Some of them made it, some of them did not. Northampton lost 49 men. There is one more thing that happened on USS New Orleans that night. 3 brothers, Edward Keith Rogers, 30 years old, Jack Ellis Rogers, 22, Charles Ethbert Rogers, 20, all from Alabama, all serving on the same ship, all stationed forward. When the bow went, they went with it. 2 weeks before Tassafaronga, 5 brothers named Sullivan had died together on USS Juno in the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Their deaths, and the deaths of the Rogers brothers, led directly to what became the sole survivor policy, the regulation that the last surviving member of a family would not be sent into combat. There is no clean way to write that sentence. There is just the fact of it. 3 boys from the same family, the same ship, the same night. The United States Navy later named a destroyer after them, USS Rogers. Their mother sponsored the ship at its launching. Tanaka was already running north when Northampton went down. He did not see it. His ships were at 33 knots, moving up the slot toward the shortlands, supplies still on deck, mission not completed. He had left one ship behind. Takanami, the escort that had fired first, that had drawn the attention of every American gun in the task force, while the rest of the Japanese destroyers put their torpedoes in the water, was burning and dead in the water near Tassafaronga Point. Her crew fought to save her through the night. They could not. Takanami sank before dawn. That was Tanaka's total loss for the evening. 1 destroyer. Against 1 American cruiser sunk, 3 more knocked out of the war for the better part of a year. Wright did not understand what had hit him. In his after-action report, he wrote that his ships must have been attacked by submarines, because the position of Tanaka's destroyers, as he understood it, made it impossible for surface torpedoes to have caused that kind of damage. He was not being dishonest. He genuinely did not know. The Americans in 1942 did not yet fully grasp what the Long Lance could do. They were still measuring Japanese torpedoes by the capabilities of their own: shorter range, slower speed, visible wakes. Wright had watched 4 of his cruisers get torn open by weapons he didn't believe could reach him from ships he thought were in the wrong position to fire. He wrote what the evidence, as he understood it, allowed him to write. He was wrong, and he was not the last man in the Pacific to be wrong about that. Halsey read Wright's report. He did not question the assessment of submarine attack. He did not question the inflated kill count. Wright had claimed 4 Japanese destroyers sunk. The actual number was 1. What Halsey questioned was Cole. In his comments on the report, Halsey wrote that Cole had fired his torpedoes from too great a distance and wasted them, that Cole should have moved closer to the enemy instead of taking the shot he had. Cole had been in the right position. Cole had fired at the right time. Cole had asked for permission twice and been told to wait. None of that appeared in Halsey's comments. What appeared was the name of the man who had done the right thing, attached to the blame for what went wrong. Cole did not argue. He was not in a position to argue. He went back to sea and kept fighting. Wright was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions that night. The citation acknowledged the difficult circumstances. It recognized the effort. It did not mention the 4 minutes. Tanaka arrived back at the shortlands before dawn. The drums were still on the decks of 6 of his ships. The soldiers on Guadalcanal would go hungry for another day. He wrote his report. He described the engagement accurately. 1 destroyer lost, 4 American cruisers hit, supply mission not completed. And then, As he had done before and would do again, he added the part no one had asked for. Guadalcanal could not be held. The supply runs were not working. The men on the island were dying not from American bullets, but from starvation. The only question that mattered now was how many of them could be brought home before there were none left to bring. Nobody in Tokyo wanted to read that. They read it anyway, and filed it away. On December 12th, Tanaka led another run down the slot. PT boats were waiting. 2 of them caught his flagship Teruzuki in the dark and put torpedoes into her. The ship went down. Tanaka was wounded in the blast, pulled from the water, and transferred to another vessel as Teruzuki slipped under. He continued the mission. He brought the remaining ships back to base. He filed his report. On December 29th, 1942, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka was transferred to Singapore. The official reason was his wounds. He had not asked to leave. He had not requested a transfer. He had not done anything wrong by the measure of any standard a Navy court could apply. But he had said, repeatedly, clearly, and in writing, that the campaign his superiors were running was going to fail. And in the Imperial Japanese Navy, that was a thing a man said once, quietly, and then stopped saying. Tanaka had said it many times, at full volume. By the end of December, Imperial General Headquarters had finally accepted what Tanaka had been saying since early December. Guadalcanal would be evacuated. Over 3 nights in early February, Japanese destroyers ran a different kind of mission, not bringing men in, but taking the survivors out. The Americans, watching the destroyers approach, initially reported it as a reinforcement run. It looked like every other Tokyo Express operation. By the time the truth was confirmed, the ships were already gone. More than 10,000 men got out. More than 20,000 did not come home from that island. Tanaka was in Singapore when the evacuation happened. He had been right about all of it. He was not there to see it. In February of 1943, a commander named Arleigh Burke arrived in the South Pacific. He had spent the first 14 months of the war at a desk in Washington, reading action reports from the Solomon Islands. Every one of them. He read Savo Island. He read Cape Esperance. He read the naval battle of Guadalcanal. And he read Tassafaronga. He had requested sea duty the week Pearl Harbor was attacked. The Navy had told him no and kept him at his desk. So he read. He mapped the engagements on paper. He traced each decision backward from the moment the shooting stopped to the moment the first mistake was made. And in report after report, from engagement after engagement, he kept finding the same sequence: contact, hesitation, request for permission, wait, fire. And somewhere in the gap between the moment a man saw the enemy and the moment he was authorized to shoot, Japanese torpedoes found their targets in the dark. Burke circled that sequence every time he found it. He wrote 3 words in the margin. This is why. When Burke arrived in the Solomon Islands, he asked to see the surviving officers who had been in the night engagements. And he listened. What they told him confirmed everything he had read. The sequence never changed. Contact, hesitation, permission, fire. By the time the last step happened, the window had already closed. Burke had never fired a gun in combat. He had never stood on a bridge in the dark with Japanese torpedoes in the water. But he understood the problem. He sat down and wrote a document. Not a request, not a recommendation, an order. 1 sentence, printed in capital letters, distributed to every captain under his command. Destroyers are to attack on enemy contact without orders from the task force commander. 5 sentences followed. The first 2. If it will help kill the enemy, it's important. If it does not help kill the enemy, it's not important. The captains who read it looked up from the page. What Burke was ordering went against everything they had been trained to do. In the United States Navy, in every major navy in the world, a captain waited for orders before he fired on an enemy vessel. That was not a preference. That was how naval warfare worked. Burke was telling them the war had changed, and the old way was getting men killed. Not one of them argued. On November 25, 1943, Burke took Destroyer Squadron 23 north to intercept 5 Japanese destroyers moving south through the slot. At 1:41 in the morning, radar made contact. 5 ships, 18 miles ahead, moving south. Their radar had not yet found the Americans. Under the old doctrine, report contact, verify, request permission, fire. Under Burke's doctrine, fire. No call up the chain of command. No request for permission. No pause while the window closed. The Japanese destroyer Onami took a torpedo and went down fast. The explosion loud enough to be heard on the bridge of every ship in the squadron. 2 more Japanese destroyers were sunk before the engagement was over. Burke brought his ships south at first light. 0 American casualties. 0 American ships damaged. The Naval War College studied the engagement after the war and called it formally an almost perfect surface action. Cole never received a formal apology from the United States Navy. He continued to serve. He went back to sea. He did what officers do when the institution they belong to has treated them unjustly. He kept showing up. For 50 years, the official record of Tassafaronga stood largely as Halsey had written it. Then, in 1995, a man named Russell Crenshaw published a book. Crenshaw had been the gunnery officer aboard USS Maury that night. He had been on that water. He had watched what happened from a position where he could see all of it. He spent years going back through the records, Japanese after-action reports declassified after the war, survivor testimony from both sides, the geometry of the engagement reconstructed from every available source. His conclusion was unambiguous. Cole had done everything correctly. Cole had been in the right position. Cole had fired at the right moment. Cole had asked for permission twice and been denied. The problem was not Cole. The problem was a doctrine that required a man to ask permission at the exact moment when asking permission was the most dangerous thing he could do. Halsey had blamed the wrong man. The book was published by the Naval Institute Press. Cole had been dead for years by then. He never knew the record had been corrected. In the summer of 1956, the United States Naval Institute reached out to Tanaka. They wanted him to write about Guadalcanal. His account had never been told in English. American readers, naval officers, historians, the men who had been in those waters, deserved to hear it from the man who had been on the other side. Tanaka agreed. He wrote 2 long pieces, published in the Proceedings of the United States Naval Institute in July and August of 1956, 14 years after the battles he was describing. About Tassafaronga specifically, he wrote this: "I have heard that U.S. naval experts praised my command in that action. I am not deserving of such honors." He did not explain what he meant. He did not need to. A man who tells you he doesn't deserve credit for a victory is telling you something about what he believes should have happened. What he believed was this: the Americans had every advantage that night. Position, radar, firepower, intelligence. They had found him in the dark before he found them. They had a plan that, executed cleanly, would have ended the engagement before his torpedoes reached the water. He won because 4 minutes passed between the moment Cole asked for permission and the moment Wright gave it. That is not a victory he felt entitled to. About Guadalcanal as a whole, he wrote, "There is no question that Japan's doom was sealed with the closing of the struggle for Guadalcanal." The man who ran the Tokyo Express, who filed reports that nobody wanted to read, who said out loud what his superiors were not willing to hear, and paid for it with the only command he had ever wanted. Sitting in Japan 14 years later, writing in a language that was not his own, for the men who had been on the other side of every one of those dark nights, and saying plainly that they were right, not as a concession, as a fact. Burke read the proceedings article. He was Chief of Naval Operations by then, the highest position in the United States Navy, the job that had been waiting for him since that desk in Washington, where he spent 14 months reading reports and writing in margins. There is no record of what Burke said when he read Tanaka's words about Tassafaronga. No memo, no margin note. Just the fact that the man who had spent a year studying why Americans were dying in the dark had lived long enough to read the enemy's own account confirming what he had figured out. 4 minutes. That was the distance between the battle that happened and the battle that should have happened. Burke had closed that distance with one sentence in capital letters. Tanaka had spent 14 years figuring out how to say it in English. Burke served as Chief of Naval Operations for 6 years, 1955 to 1961. 3 consecutive terms, the only officer in American history to serve that many in that position. After the war, he worked to rebuild Japan's maritime defense force, not as a gesture, not as politics, as a practical matter. The Pacific needed stability. Japan needed a navy that could defend its own waters. Burke lent them aircraft. He shared training doctrine. He spent years working alongside officers of the country he had spent 2 years fighting. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force called him a benefactor. They still do. Tanaka died on July 9, 1969. He was 77 years old. He had been right about Guadalcanal. He had been right about the supply runs. He had been right about the evacuation. The Imperial Japanese Navy had taken all of that and transferred him to Singapore. He wrote his account in 1956 because someone asked him to. There is no record of whether he found satisfaction in finally saying, plainly and in print, what he had been writing in classified reports that nobody wanted to read. Men like Tanaka rarely think in those terms. They do the job in front of them. They say what they see. And when the system removes them for saying it, they find another job and do that one too. Burke died on January 1st, 1996. He was 94 years old. The United States Navy named its most advanced class of guided missile destroyers after him, an honor given to a living person only 4 times in the history of the service since 1861. Burke was one of them. Those ships are still sailing today, built around a doctrine of independent action and forward decision-making, the principle that the man who sees the enemy is the man who fires. The principle Burke wrote in capital letters in 1943 on a mimeographed page handed to 8 captains in the South Pacific. Wright was not court-martialed. He was reassigned. He served out the war in other positions. History remembers him as the admiral who lost 3 cruisers at Tassafaronga. That is not entirely fair. Wright was given command of Task Force 67 6 days before the battle. He was handed a plan he had not developed, for waters he did not know, against an enemy whose weapons he did not fully understand. He followed the doctrine he had been given. The doctrine was wrong. That is the difference between a man who failed and a system that had not yet learned what it needed to learn. The price of that lesson was paid by the men on Northampton, by Edward Keith, Jack Ellis, and Charles Ethbert Rogers on New Orleans, by nearly 400 Americans across the task force on the last night of November, 1942. Every Navy that fought in that war lost battles. Every Navy had nights it would rather not have had. What separated the United States Navy, what Burke understood from that desk in Washington, reading report after report with a pencil in his hand, was the willingness to look at what happened, name it accurately, and change, Not in theory. Not in a memo filed and forgotten. In doctrine. In training. In the standing orders handed to 8 captains before they ever left port together. Tassafaronga was not the story of a defeat. It was the story of a price paid, a lesson learned, and a Navy that looked at those names and decided that was enough. The water off Guadalcanal is called Ironbottom Sound because of what is on the bottom of it. Over 50 ships, American and Japanese, thousands of men. They went down over 6 months of fighting in an engagement that neither side had planned for, and neither side could stop once it started. The men who survived went home. Most of them did not talk about it much, not because they were hiding something. Because there are things that happen in the dark, in the middle of the ocean, far from anywhere a person can point to on a map, that do not translate cleanly into dinner table conversation. You were there, or you weren't. And if you were, you carried it the way men carry things that don't have a name for what they are, quietly, and for the rest of your life. If your father served in the Pacific, on a destroyer, a cruiser, a carrier, anywhere in those waters, leave his name in the comments. His ship, his rate or rank. One thing he said once that stayed with you. Tanaka wrote his account because he believed the story deserved to be told completely. The men who were on the American side of that story, the ones who were in the water that night, the ones who held the line on the ships that stayed afloat, the ones who went back out the next week and the week after, most of them are gone now. The stories they carried aren't in any archive. They don't exist in any document. They only exist in the people who were told them. Don't let them disappear.
Late night, June 18th, 1944. Flag bridge of USS Indianapolis, somewhere in the Philippine Sea. Admiral Raymond Spruance is holding a message from Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. The message is a request. Mitcher wants permission to take Task Force 58 west through the night, to close the distance to the Japanese fleet, to be in strike position at dawn, to go after the carriers while the chance still exists. Spruance has 1 hour to decide. He refuses. In that room, no one agrees with him. Mitcher is furious. Arleigh Burke, Mitcher's chief of staff, the man who will go on to become the greatest chief of naval operations in the history of the United States Navy, calls it the worst decision of the war. 2 months later, Admiral John Towers, Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, formally demands that Nimitz relieve Spruance of command. Not a private complaint over dinner, a written request. It circulates through the Pacific Fleet. Spruance says nothing in his own defense. Not one word, not then, not later, not ever. But there is one man who does not join that chorus, not King, not Nimitz. The man is Ozawa, the Japanese admiral who sat on the other side of that battle, who launched 4 waves of aircraft into the sky that morning and watched them all disappear. Ozawa never praised Raymond Spruance in a single recorded sentence. What he left instead was something more revealing than a quote. He left his battle plan. And that plan tells you exactly what Ozawa thought of Raymond Spruance, more clearly than any interview, any post-war account, any statement made in the comfortable distance of peacetime. What it says, and why the enemy understood this man before his own Navy ever did, is what we are going to walk through today. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. You just heard what happened in that room. Mitcher wanted to go west. Spruance said no. Every aviator in the Pacific Fleet said Spruance was wrong. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done? Go west and chase the carriers, or stay and protect the troops on the beach? There is no clean answer. That's exactly why this story matters. There is a standard reference book called Who's Who in America. Most senior military officers during World War II had entries of a paragraph or more. Raymond Spruance's entry was 3 lines long. Name, rank, 2 facts. His choice. Reporters came to interview him throughout the war and after. He sat with them in silence until they ran out of questions and left with nothing printable. This was not shyness. He explained it himself in a speech at the Naval Academy. Personal publicity in a war can be a drawback because it may affect a man's thinking. A man's judgment is best when he can forget himself and any reputation he may have acquired and can concentrate wholly on making the right decision. He was not avoiding the press. He was protecting his own thinking from his own ego. While Spruance was sitting in silence with reporters, Admiral William Halsey was on the cover of Time magazine. Halsey's quotes were on recruitment posters. His name was in the newspapers every week. 2 admirals, the same ocean, the same war. One was built for public consumption. The other was built for something else. His wife asked him after the war what he made of all of it, the whole long stretch from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. He said, "It was interesting." His biography is called The Quiet Warrior. His historian, Thomas Buell, spent years studying him and called him an intellectual in the purest sense, a man of superior mental power. Then noted that he never published a word, gave no speeches worth remembering, and had formal education that ended at Annapolis. What he had was something harder to put a name to: the ability to think without needing anyone to see him thinking, the ability to be right without needing to be known for it. Captain George Dyer served under both Spruance and Halsey. He described the difference in terms any sailor would understand. "My feeling was one of confidence when Spruance was there and one of concern when Halsey was there. When you moved into Admiral Halsey's command, you never knew what you were going to do in the next 5 minutes. When you moved into Admiral Spruance's command, the printed instructions were up to date, and you did things in accordance with them." Not a historian's verdict, a ship captain's daily reality. Across the Pacific, in Tokyo, a different kind of officer was being produced. Admiral Yamamoto was a national icon. His death in April 1943 triggered official state mourning across Japan. The system that produced him rewarded men who projected certainty, men who spoke in terms of decisive battle, who looked like they already knew they were going to win, whose confidence was itself a military asset. Ozawa was considered that system's most sophisticated product, a carrier warfare theorist, scientifically minded, a man who had mastered carrier warfare from first principles without ever having flown a plane himself. The difference between Ozawa and Spruance was not intelligence. Both were sharp. Both were serious. Both had spent their careers thinking carefully about naval war. The difference was what their systems asked of them. One system asked its admirals to win battles. The other asked its admirals to look like they were winning battles. The gap between those 2 things is where the war was decided. But before Spruance could face Ozawa, he first had to survive a system that almost didn't pick him. May 1942. Admiral William Halsey is hospitalized with a debilitating skin condition, severe dermatitis so extreme he cannot stand his duties. Nimitz needs a replacement within days for the most consequential naval operation the United States has planned since the war began. Halsey names Spruance himself. Not because Spruance is the obvious choice, not because anyone on the staff had been pushing his name, because Halsey had worked alongside Spruance for months and trusted his judgment above every other officer he could name. That trust, offered from a hospital bed, is the only reason Raymond Spruance is in this story at all. Spruance had never commanded a carrier task force. His career was destroyers, cruisers, battleships, the older, slower, gun-centered world of naval warfare. He walked onto the flag bridge of USS Enterprise, inheriting Halsey's staff, men who had not chosen him, who were watching carefully to see whether this surface officer understood what he was holding. He launched. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Spruance sent his dive bombers at extreme range, a range that left almost no margin for error, hoping to catch Nagumo's carriers in the middle of rearming. He caught them. By afternoon, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The strike force that had launched against Pearl Harbor, that had swept across the Indian Ocean, that had been the most powerful carrier formation on the planet, gone in hours. That night, against his staff's recommendation, Spruance pulled east, away from the retreating Japanese surface fleet, away from the chance to finish Yamamoto's main force. Critics said it immediately: too cautious, a missed opportunity. What nobody knew at the time was this: Yamamoto had sent his surface fleet east that night specifically to find and destroy Spruance. If Spruance had kept heading west, he would have sailed directly into it, in the dark, without air cover, outgunned by battleships and cruisers that would have made short work of his carriers. The decision that drew the most criticism was the decision that saved the fleet. Spruance never said so. He did not explain it to the critics. He did not correct the record. He went back to work. On the other side of that battle, the Imperial Japanese Navy was absorbing a lesson it was not yet capable of learning. Vice Admiral Nagumo had been chosen to command Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier strike force, at Midway because he had led it successfully at Pearl Harbor. The logic was clean. The man who won the last battle commands the next one. But Pearl Harbor and Midway were not the same battle. Pearl Harbor was a surprise strike against a fixed, unalerted target. Everything about it rewarded a certain kind of command, careful planning in advance, disciplined execution, aggressive attack. Midway required something different: split-second decisions under contradictory information, choosing between 2 bad options in the middle of an air attack, the ability to accept ambiguity and act anyway. Nagumo was not built for that kind of battle. The system that elevated him had never noticed the difference between the two. When the moment came, he ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed for a second strike on Midway. The rearming was half done when news arrived. American carriers were close. He reversed the order: rearm for ships. That switch was still underway when the American dive bombers found him. He lost 45 minutes he could never get back. Not because he hesitated, but because 2 reasonable decisions in sequence produced one catastrophic result. Not cowardice, not stupidity. A system that put a man in a role it had never prepared him to fill. 2 years later, the same dynamic would play out again. But this time, Spruance would face an opponent who had already done his homework. Before we get to Spruance's decision, we need to understand the plan Ozawa had already made, because the plan tells you everything. Ozawa knew the numbers: 9 Japanese carriers against 15 American, roughly 430 aircraft against nearly 900. He was not operating under any illusion about force parity. His plan, Operation A-Go, was not designed to win through superior numbers. It was designed to win through geometry. Japanese carrier aircraft had significantly longer range than their American counterparts. If Ozawa could position himself at 300 miles or more from Task Force 58, he could launch strikes that American aircraft could not return. The outer air battle doctrine: attack without being attacked back. The plan had one non-negotiable requirement written into the operational order before a single ship moved: the American commander will advance west when contact is made. That was the assumption. The entire architecture, Kurita's van as bait in front, Ozawa's main force positioned behind waiting to strike. Every piece of it depended on the American admiral doing what every previous American admiral had done: chase the carriers. According to analysis published in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings, Ozawa had studied Spruance's record carefully enough to calibrate his plan around it. He knew Spruance had a reputation for caution. He expected that caution to express itself as aggression once the Japanese fleet was located, that Spruance would push west to close the range and destroy the enemy. He was right about the caution. He was wrong about which direction it would cut. Now look at what Spruance was holding on that flag bridge. Among the intelligence documents available to him were captured Japanese planning papers that had been recovered from the wreckage connected to the combined fleet's operations. Those papers showed, in explicit terms, that Japanese naval doctrine included the end run: draw the main American fleet west with a carrier bait force, send a second force around the flank, hit the invasion shipping at Saipan while the carriers are 100 miles away chasing nothing. This was not speculation. This was written Japanese doctrine in American hands, and on the beaches of Saipan, 128,000 American troops were ashore. The transports were still at anchor. If Task Force 58 moved west and a Japanese surface force came around behind it, those men had no naval cover. The campaign did not stall. It collapsed. Shortly before midnight on June 18th, Nimitz relayed a radio direction finding fix to Spruance. Ozawa's fleet was approximately 355 miles west-southwest of Task Force 58. Mitcher sent his request. The logic was sound and Spruance knew it. If Task Force 58 steamed west through the night, by dawn it could be within striking range. The Japanese carriers would still be beyond American attack range, but the gap would be closed, and the first strike of the day would be American. Arleigh Burke, waiting outside the decision room, said it plainly later. "We knew we were going to have hell slugged out of us in the morning, and we knew we couldn't reach them." Spruance sat with the message for over an hour. He would write to historian Samuel Eliot Morison years afterward, "I think that going out after the Japanese and knocking their carriers out would have been much better and more satisfactory than waiting for them to attack us, but we were at the start of a very important and large amphibious operation, and we could not afford to gamble." He knew what the more satisfying answer was. He chose the correct one. At 0038 he signaled Mitcher, "End run by other carrier groups remains possibility and must not be overlooked." No explanation, no apology, no invitation to discuss further. On the other side of the Philippine Sea, Ozawa had issued his own final order to his fleet just after midnight. "This operation has an immense bearing on the fate of the Empire. It is hoped that all forces will do their utmost." He was already in position for his dawn strikes. One of his carrier division commanders, Admiral Obayashi, had begun launching fighters when he located the American fleet, then received Ozawa's signal to hold. "Let's do it properly tomorrow." Ozawa expected Task Force 58 to be moving toward him through the darkness. That was what his plan required. That was what every calculation he had made assumed. Task Force 58 was not moving. It was sitting still. Radar up. Hellcats fueled. Pilots sleeping. He would not know this until the planes were already in the air. June 19th, 1944. Ozawa launches 4 separate waves of aircraft. American radar picks up the first wave more than 150 miles out. The Hellcats are already at altitude. Roughly 300 Japanese aircraft are shot down in air combat on the first day alone. 2 Japanese fleet carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, are sunk by American submarines, before the air battle reaches its peak. A third carrier, Hio, goes down the following evening in a long-range strike launched by Mitcher at dusk. When it ends, Ozawa escapes with 6 carriers. Between all of them, there are 35 operational aircraft. Over 2 days, approximately 600 Japanese aircraft are destroyed. American losses, roughly 130, most of them during the night recovery of the June 20th strike, when pilots returning in darkness ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the sea. One American pilot, watching the first wave come in, said it was like an old-time turkey shoot. The name stuck. It was not wrong. But back in the American fleet, something else was already beginning. Mitcher said it privately within days of the battle. The enemy escaped. His fleet was not sunk. The aviator community formed a verdict quickly. The common refrain, repeated in wardrooms and staff meetings across the Pacific Fleet: "This is what comes of placing a non-aviator in command over carriers." Admiral John Towers, Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, one of the founding figures of American naval aviation, filed a formal written request demanding Spruance's relief from command. Not a private suggestion. A written demand. Nimitz read it, denied it, said nothing publicly. The following month, Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, the man who ran the entire United States Navy, arrived at Saipan. He went directly to Spruance. He said, "You did a damn fine job there. No matter what other people tell you, your decision was correct." Spruance listened, nodded, did not respond further. Across the Pacific, Ozawa arrived at Okinawa with what remained of his fleet. He offered his resignation to Admiral Toyota. Toyota refused it. "I am more responsible for this defeat than you are." Ozawa did not argue. He did not claim bad luck. He did not blame the quality of his pilots, though their inexperience was the largest single tactical factor in the result. He understood what had happened. His plan required Spruance to behave one way. Spruance had behaved another. The 6 carriers Ozawa brought home were functionally hollow. Ships without aircraft, without trained crews, unable to conduct offensive operations. Tokyo could not admit this. They remained in the order of battle. 4 months later, those same hollow carriers would sail north. Their only purpose would be to be seen on radar. Ozawa never left a statement saying Spruance made the right call. He left something more durable. He left the operational order for Ego. That order, written before the battle began, assumes in explicit terms that the American commander will advance west. The entire plan, the positioning, the geometry, the bait, collapses completely if the American commander stays near Saipan. Think about what that means. A man who designs a fleet action around his opponent's predicted behavior is not dismissing that opponent. He is studying him. He is staking everything, every ship, every aircraft, every trained pilot Japan has left, on having correctly understood how that opponent will act under pressure. Ozawa had studied Spruance's record carefully enough to build his greatest battle around predicting Spruance's response. He predicted wrong. Not because Spruance surprised him with sudden aggression. Not because Spruance did something out of character. Spruance was exactly what his reputation said he was. A man who would not abandon his stated mission for a more glorious secondary objective. Ozawa had understood the logic perfectly. He simply did not believe Spruance would hold to it when a Japanese fleet was 355 miles away, and 430 aircraft were in the air, and every other American admiral in his position would already be turning west. He underestimated not Spruance's intelligence. He underestimated Spruance's consistency. The proof arrived 4 months later. October 1944. Ozawa leads his hollow carriers north toward Leyte Gulf. Their purpose is simple: to be seen, to be recognized as carriers, to draw the American fleet away from the invasion shipping. Admiral William Halsey sees them. He does not deliberate. He takes Task Force 34 north at full speed. He does not leave a covering force at San Bernardino Strait. He does not send a message to confirm the strait is covered. He goes. Vice Admiral Kurita's fleet, Yamato, Musashi, the most powerful surface force Japan had left, comes through the unguarded strait and reaches the invasion shipping. Only Taffy 3 stands between Kurita and catastrophe. A screen of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts, small ships with small guns, fighting a surface action against battleships and heavy cruisers in one of the most desperate engagements of the entire Pacific War. Halsey had done in October exactly what Ozawa's plan had required Spruance to do in June. In June, Spruance had refused. In October, Halsey ran straight into it. Nimitz sent a dispatch to Halsey that became one of the most quoted messages of the Pacific War. "Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders." No one ever sent that message to Raymond Spruance. Ozawa had been a serious professional who studied his enemy with care. His plan was not just a military document, it was a form of professional respect, an acknowledgement that Spruance operated according to a logic Ozawa had identified, analyzed, and intended to turn against him. He got the logic exactly right. He got the man exactly wrong. The admiral in Pearl Harbor, who called Spruance a coward, had not studied him at all. The admiral, who studied him carefully enough to bet an entire fleet on predicting his behavior, was the Japanese admiral who lost. After the war, Raymond Spruance served as president of the Naval War College, then as ambassador to the Philippines. Then he retired to Pebble Beach, California. He wore old khakis and work shoes. He walked 8 to 10 miles every morning along the Monterey coast with his schnauzer, Peter. He made hot chocolate for himself every day. He worked in his greenhouse. He worked in his garden. Reporters called occasionally. He handled them the same way he always had. He wrote no memoir. He gave no lectures about the war. He made no attempt to correct the record on any of the decisions that had been criticized. When the question of the 5-star promotion came up, the decision that gave Halsey the rank and left Spruance with 4 stars, he addressed it in a letter in 1965. He wrote, "So far as my getting 5-star rank is concerned, if I could have got it along with Bill Halsey, that would have been fine. But if I had received it instead of Bill Halsey, I would have been very unhappy over it." That is not a man who felt cheated. That is not bitterness dressed up as grace. That is a man who had made his peace with something most people never accept about themselves: that being right and being recognized for being right are 2 entirely different things, and only one of them actually matters. When Admiral Ernest King wrote his memorandum weighing the 5-star candidates, he noted Halsey's errors in judgment, the 2 typhoons, Leyte Gulf, and then wrote this about Spruance. As to brains, Spruance was the best man in every way. He still recommended Halsey. Because Halsey had seniority, because Congressman Carl Vinson, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, had publicly endorsed Halsey, because the press loved Halsey, and in December 1945 that mattered in ways that operational records did not. Nimitz understood what had happened. Throughout the 1950s, he lobbied actively and repeatedly to secure Spruance's posthumous promotion to Fleet Admiral. Not quietly, not once. Tirelessly, over years. It never succeeded. Samuel Eliot Morison, the official historian of the United States Navy in World War II, published his final assessment. Spruance was one of the greatest admirals in American naval history. Not Halsey, not Mitcher, Spruance. In 2001, Congressman Mike Pence introduced legislation authorizing the president to advance Spruance posthumously to the grade of Fleet Admiral. It did not pass. In 2021, 52 years after Spruance died, another U.S. Navy officer submitted the argument again to Congress. The same case, the same evidence. His record, measured by any objective standard, exceeded the threshold for the rank he never received. It did not pass. The rank had not come while he lived, because he was not the right kind of famous. He had understood that about himself long before anyone had to explain it to him. Ozawa Jisaburo survived the war. He lived until 1966. In every account he gave of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in every interview where Operation A-Go was discussed, he described his plan the same way, built around the assumption that the American commander would come to him. He never said Spruance was right. He designed his greatest battle around predicting what Spruance would do, and Spruance did the opposite. Raymond Spruance was born on July 3, 1886. He died on December 13, 1969. He is buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Francisco, in the same ground as Chester Nimitz. The Spruance-class destroyer was named for him. 14 of them served in the United States Navy. His entry in the biographical record of the men who won the Pacific War is longer than 3 lines now. But the man himself is still described the same way by every serious historian who has studied him. The quiet warrior. The admiral who was right both times and never said a word about it. The man his enemy understood before his own navy did. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the Pacific War, in any branch, on any ship, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, or one thing they said, or one thing you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.